And I believe, and I think Ryan shares this view, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has probably induced even greater caution and increased the perception in Xi Jinping's mind of the cost that he might pay, because if the PLA were to try to take Taiwan and fail, that could weaken Xi Jinping's position. It could potentially undermine the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. So there are people who think that this is reunification is a legacy issue for Xi Jinping. I think that the jury is still out on that question.
And so Bonnie mentioned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I mean, like, this book literally came out less than 2 weeks ago, and so it is extraordinarily topical and up to date. And Ryan, as Bonnie mentioned, the status quo isn't static. You talk about, Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. You talk about in the book how President Biden, at least informally, has made assurances, or off the record, on the record, assurances that the United States will come will give military support for Taiwan in the event of an invasion. So what are all these very, very recent events having as an impact on the status quo that has maintained the peace for the last 40 plus years?
Well, Steve, the three events that you've identified all are tied together by one common thread, which is that they have raised alarm and concern about the prospect of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. But beyond that, I would probably break each of them apart and look at them each on their own merits. Speaker Pelosi's visit, I think it was done with good intentions. I think that she wanted to show the people of Taiwan that they're not alone, to deal with their bully to the West, and to send a signal of reassurance to the Taiwan people that we stand with them. Now, honest people can disagree about the effects or impacts of that, but the Taiwan people seem to have judged that they incurred more cost than benefit from that trip. If you look at polling of public attitudes, asking the question if Taiwan was safer before or after Speaker Pelosi's trip. So I think that we should take note of that. We should take stock of that and use that to inform our own thinking about what the Taiwan people really seek from the United States and what they find is troublesome. I think a similar story can be told about President Biden's statements. He has said 4 times, I believe, publicly on the record that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense if attacked. I think it's done with good intentions to signal reassurance to the people of Taiwan and to try to deter China from taking military action. But we have to be honest, it is a departure from longstanding practice and policy, and it could create problems. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think, has offered just a haunting reminder of the real risk of what it is that we're talking about at its core, which is, the risk that an authoritarian leader who has consolidated power could come to believe that it is his duty to avenge past humiliations. And so I don't think that we treat the prospect of conflict lightly in this book, but we do try to right size it, including by discussing some of the issues that Bonnie just touched upon a moment ago about the indivisible risks that China's leaders would have to accept if they were to choose military options to pursue their goals.
And Bonnie, you write that you and Ryan write and Richard write in the book that a cross-strait conflict would likely produce a global recession, if not a depression. It would disrupt Asian and international trade, sever major supply chains, and could collapse international financial systems. So obviously, as business leaders in the region, those are very haunting words. Why do you think that would be a real possibility?
Well, just quickly before I answer that, Steve, I want to add just one point to Ryan's previous answer, that some people, although a lot of us have paid attention to the fact that President Biden has said 4 times that he would come to the defense of Taiwan, I think not enough people pay attention to the statement that President Biden has said twice, which is, I think, seen by China as extremely provocative, and that is that Taiwan's a democracy, should be able to decide for itself whether it wants to be independent. And no American president has ever said anything like that. So I like to remind people of that. The president has a prerogative to say we will defend Taiwan, if China attacks it. But I think this other statement is really quite seen as quite provocative by China. So your question about the impact of a cross-strait conflict. Hopefully, many of you have read the report that was put out by the Rhodium Group late last year, which analyzes this issue, I think, in a way that has had an enormous impact on many countries. And I deal quite a bit with Europe since moving from CSIS to the German Marshall Fund. And they really paid attention to this report because the impact on Europe of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been really significant, as they now have to get, oil and gas from elsewhere. But in the Rhodium report, essentially assumed a scenario of no use of kinetic force, a very low end contingency of having just China imposing a blockade around Taiwan. And of course, that means essentially stopping goods from going in and out, and calculated that the impact would be $2.5 trillion annualized impact on the global economy. So, that's really incredibly significant. Taiwan is the world's 16th largest trading economy. In 2021, it imported and exported $922 billion in goods and services. And all of this trade would be severely disrupted in the event of a blockade, not to mention also, of course, the goods coming out of China, because a lot of the world would begin to curtail their trade with China. Of course, we could zoom in on the fact that Taiwan produces 92% of the world's most advanced logic chips, as well as I think somewhere between a third and a half of global output for the legacy chips. So the sort of rough conservative estimate of dependence on Taiwan's chips suggests that companies in these industries that depend on these chips, like automobiles and iPhones, et cetera, could be forced to forego as much as $1.6 trillion in revenue annually in the event of this scenario of a blockade. And then, of course, there's the possibility of countries around the world imposing sanctions on China. And the Biden administration is quietly talking to many countries, including the European Union, about what sanctions they could impose, cutting China off from SWIFT, export controls, perhaps even restrictions on some exports to China. And none of that, of course, has been talked about publicly, but I believe that some of what is being discussed between the US and its allies is being communicated privately directly to Xi Jinping. So I believe that these many countries would take actions that would inflict a great deal of pain on China. And by communicating this willingness to do so in peacetime, that, of course, then will raise the cost, as I mentioned earlier, to Xi Jinping, and hopefully strengthen deterrence. So this would have a really huge, I think, impact if there was a conflict on global trade. And I think that every country in the world would be affected by it. And so this is it's a massive problem to even think through what kind of catastrophic impact it would have. So we have to hope that just never happens.